Hello students, teachers, parents, history nerds. Hello everybody, and welcome to Nutshelled History, where we lay out the facts, the good, the bad, and the ugly. We continue with our Early America series by looking at society and culture before the Civil War. This is the full topic, so this one is longer than the individual lessons. Check the description down below for a fill-in-the-blanks worksheet that goes along with this video. I just ask that you like and subscribe. I apologize in advance for any mispronunciations. I do my best. All right, now let's go. The Industrial Revolution. In the early 1800s, America got hit with a European import that wasn't fancy tea or weird royal drama. It was the Industrial Revolution. This game changer flipped the script on how goods were made and how people worked and lived. Gone were the days of cozy home spinning and weaving. Factories popped up like mushrooms after a rainstorm, packed with fancy new spinning machines and mechanical looms. While most people still toiled away on farms, many packed their bags and moved closer to these noisy, bustling mills. Instead of working whenever they felt like it, factory workers had to follow schedules. Yes, alarm clocks became the enemy early on. The big bosses, known as capitalists, weren't in it for the fun. They were all about making a hefty profit. Britain, being a bit of a control freak, tried to keep its mill technology under wraps. Enter Samuel Slater, a man with a head full of blueprints and no need for a notebook. He arrived in America, rolled up his sleeves, and built the country's first successful water-powered textile mill. Boom! Industrialization was officially in business. Meanwhile, Eli Whitney had an aha moment with interchangeable parts. Instead of making guns one by one like an old-school blacksmith, he used machines to crank them out factory style. This genius idea spread faster than gossip in a small town, transforming how goods were made and putting New England on the manufacturing map. One of the biggest factory towns was Lowell, Massachusetts, where a group of investors decided, hey, let's get some hard-working farm girls in here. These so-called Lowell girls worked long, grueling hours but earned their own money, most of which they dutifully sent home. While the pay was nice, the working conditions were, let's just say, not great. The factory boom didn't just change work life, it reshaped home life and even tweaked how society viewed men and women. As manufacturing exploded, so did cities. But urban life had a few, shall we say, quirks. Poor sanitation, questionable drinking water, and streets that looked and smelled like disaster zones made city living a risky business. Yet people still flocked to these growing hubs, lured by the promise of opportunity. American inventors weren't sitting idle either. The cast iron stove made cooking indoors less of a fire hazard. New farming equipment like the mechanical reaper and steel plow made harvesting easier. And, perhaps most groundbreaking of all, the telegraph made it possible to send messages in minutes instead of weeks. Suddenly, long-distance communication wasn't just yelling across fields. And just like that, America was on a one-way track to modern industry, whether it was ready or not. Industrialization and immigration. Steam power was the Industrial Revolution's secret sauce. With steam-powered factories cranking out goods faster than ever, and locomotives getting better at not exploding, markets expanded at full speed. Railroads originally played Uber for cargo, hauling goods to canals where they hitched a ride on boats. But by the 1830s, locomotives decided they didn't need a middleman anymore. Once engineers worked out a few minor technical difficulties, like trains randomly flying off the tracks, rail travel became the safest way to move goods and people. By 1850, the U.S. was laced with railroads, shuttling raw materials to factories and finished products to eager customers. Business was booming, but not everyone was cheering. Factories in the 1850s were a far cry from the quaint little mills of the past. Workers, including entire families, clocked in for marathon shifts, earning wages that barely covered rent and potatoes. Safety regulations? Never heard of them. With no laws to protect workers, injuries were just part of the job. Skilled artisans, sick of the nonsense, formed trade unions and went on strike, successfully because factory owners actually needed them. Unfortunately for unskilled workers and women, unions weren't much help. Then came the immigrants. In the 1840s, millions of people from Western Europe packed their bags and crossed the ocean. Ireland got hit especially hard when a nasty disease wiped out its potato crops. leading to mass starvation. Thousands of Irish families arrived in America, swapping farm labor for railroad building and housekeeping. Meanwhile, many Germans fled failed revolutions at home and sought a fresh start in the U.S. These folks weren't just sightseeing. Famine and political chaos basically pushed them onto the next available boat. Of course, not everyone welcomed the newcomers with open arms. Nativists, America's original grumpy gatekeepers, wanted the country reserved for white, American-born Protestants. They even formed their own political party, the Know Nothing Party, yes, really, which was proudly anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic. Meanwhile, African Americans in the North faced discrimination even though they were free. They were often shut out of voting, factory jobs, and skilled trades. Public spaces, including schools and churches, were segregated, so they built their own institutions: newspapers, schools, churches, and colleges, proving that when doors close, sometimes you just build a new house. And so steam engines roared, factories churned, immigrants arrived, and society clashed, all part of America's chaotic ride into the modern age. King Cotton and life in the South. As the North's textile mills hummed along, they needed more and more cotton. Enter Eli Whitney in 1793 with his game-changing invention, the cotton gin, a spiked wooden cylinder that could remove seeds from cotton faster than you can say manual labor is exhausting. This meant farmers could now grow more cotton than ever before. Unfortunately, more cotton also meant more enslaved labor, because while machines could separate seeds, they still couldn't pick the cotton. Cotton quickly became the South's MVP cash crop, with rice, sugarcane, and tobacco playing backup. Meanwhile, hillier regions skipped the farming craze and focused on raising hogs, cattle, and mules. Because let's face it, even in the South, not everything can be covered in cotton. Industry? Well, it existed, sort of. The South dabbled in tool-making, machinery, and flour milling, but since the enslaved population wasn't exactly a booming consumer base, most manufactured goods came from the North or Europe. At the top of Southern society sat the cottonocracy. Basically, the 1% of plantation owners who owned 20 or more enslaved people and lived like European aristocrats, complete with grand mansions and impeccable fashion choices. The majority of Southerners, however, lived on small farms, sometimes owning 1 or 2 enslaved people and working alongside them. Poor white farmers, on the other hand, rented land and grew humble crops like potatoes and corn, dreaming of the day they might make it big in the cotton game. Cities? Yeah, not really a thing in the South. A small number of African Americans in the South were free, either because their ancestors had been freed after the Revolution, or because they had managed to buy their own freedom. But freedom was a relative term. Many states passed laws making life difficult for free African Americans, and in some places, they risked being kidnapped and sold back into slavery. Despite this, free African Americans made major contributions to Southern communities. For the vast majority of enslaved African Americans, however, life was unimaginably harsh. They had no rights, and slave codes ensured they couldn't gather in groups, learn to read, or even testify in court. Their work ranged from grueling farm labor to household duties, and punishment for any perceived misstep could be brutal. Their only protection was the fact that slave owners viewed them as valuable property, like a very cruel version of taking care of your car so it doesn't break down. Yet despite the horrors of slavery, enslaved African Americans found ways to resist. Some worked slowly, some accidentally broke equipment, and some made daring escapes to the north. A few even led rebellions. The most famous of these was Nat Turner's 1831 revolt, which lasted 2 months and terrified the South so much that states passed even harsher laws restricting African Americans' rights. Most white Southerners defended slavery, arguing that it was somehow more humane than the free labor system in the North. Critics, however, pointed out that factory workers could at least quit a bad job, something enslaved people definitely couldn't do. Plus, the physical and psychological abuse endured by those in bondage was undeniable. By the 1830s, some Northerners were calling for slavery to be abolished altogether. The South remained deeply dependent on agriculture, leading the nation in livestock production and cash crops like cotton, rice, sugar, and tobacco. Farming was so profitable that Southerners saw little need to industrialize. Instead, they relied on the North not just for manufactured goods, but also for loans to expand their plantations. In short, while cotton was king in the South, it was the North that kept the financial gears turning. Abolitionism. Vermont got the ball rolling in 1777 by banning slavery, and Massachusetts followed suit 3 years later. By 1804, every northern state had either ended slavery or at least promised to do so, kind of like that one friend who swears they'll start eating healthy next Monday. Slavery wasn't crucial to the northern economy, and religious groups like the Quakers took a hard pass on the whole owning people thing, calling it out as a major moral no-no. In 1817, the American Colonization Society came up with what seemed like a brilliant idea: free enslaved African Americans and send them to Liberia, a colony in Africa. The problem? Most enslaved people had been born in America and had no interest in relocating to a place they'd never seen. Imagine someone telling you they're sending you back home to a country you've never visited. Yeah, no thanks. By 1830, only about 1,400 people had made the trip, proving the plan was about as popular as unsalted popcorn. Anti-slavery sentiment got a big boost during the Second Great Awakening, when fiery preachers like Charles Finney started calling slavery out as pure evil. By the mid-1800s, more Americans were jumping on the abolitionist bandwagon, demanding slavery's immediate end instead of a slow phase-out. Leading the charge were Frederick Douglass, who had escaped slavery and become a brilliant speaker and writer, and William Lloyd Garrison, who started The Liberator, an abolitionist newspaper that ruffled quite a few feathers in 1831. Then there was the Underground Railroad, not an actual railroad, but a top-secret network of people helping enslaved individuals escape to freedom. Conductors like Harriet Tubman, who escaped slavery herself, risked their lives to guide hundreds to safety. Meanwhile, Mary Pleasant, another formerly enslaved woman, helped others escape before heading west to California, where she became a successful businesswoman because apparently she wasn't just good at defying slavery, but also at making money. In total, possibly 50,000 people escaped using this underground network. But abolitionists weren't exactly met with high fives everywhere they went. Many northern mill owners, bankers, and merchants were making bank off southern cotton, so they weren't keen on rocking the boat. Northern workers also worried that freed African Americans would take their jobs, because apparently job security in the 1800s was just as anxiety-inducing as it is today. Meanwhile, Southerners, convinced that all Northerners were secret abolitionists, started panicking that their entire way of life was under attack. And just like that, the tension between North and South kept heating up, kind of like a kettle that was about to blow its lid. Spoiler alert, it did. Reform and women's rights. The years between 1810 and 1860 were a whirlwind of change, often called the era of reform, because apparently people back then looked around and thought, wow, we really need to fix some stuff. Political ideals, the chaos of growing cities, and a religious movement known as the Second Great Awakening combined forces to spark a nationwide urge to make things better. Leading the charge was Dorothea Dix, a Boston schoolteacher who took one look at the state of prisons and care for the disabled and said, absolutely not. Thanks to her efforts, conditions improved, though let's be honest, there was nowhere to go but up. Meanwhile, the temperance movement, a polite term for people very mad at alcohol, kicked off in the 1820s. Reformers blamed booze for everything from crime to general bad decision-making. They scored a big win in 1851 when Maine became the first state to ban alcohol sales, and 8 other states followed, though unsurprisingly, not everyone was thrilled about this. As voting rights expanded for men, reformers realized, hey, maybe we should educate these new voters so they know what they're doing. Enter Horace Mann, who revolutionized public education in Massachusetts by building new schools, sorting kids into grades, so no more 17-year-olds sitting next to 7-year-olds, and ensuring teachers were actually trained and paid. By the 1850s, most northern states had free, tax-supported elementary schools. Other reformers worked to educate African Americans as well as students who were deaf or blind, because everyone deserved a chance to hit the books. Women, meanwhile, were starting to realize they were doing a whole lot of work in reform movements, but still didn't have basic rights. Leading the charge were Sojourner Truth, a former enslaved woman turned fiery activist, and Lucretia Mott, a Quaker abolitionist who believed in equality for all. Mott teamed up with Elizabeth Cady Stanton to organize the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, the first ever women's rights convention. Around 200 women and 40 men showed up, including Frederick Douglass, who clearly knew a good cause when he saw one. They passed a series of resolutions demanding equality, but the idea of women voting made some attendees clutch their pearls. After some debate, it passed, narrowly. The Seneca Falls Convention marked the official start of the women's rights movement, and Stanton soon found her perfect partner in crime, Susan B. Anthony. Anthony traveled the country, making speeches, convincing lawmakers to recognize women's rights, and generally making life difficult for people who preferred things the old-fashioned way. She and Stanton managed to get New York to pass a law protecting women's property rights, and other states soon followed, some even allowing married women to keep their own wages. The movement also put a spotlight on education. Emma Willard opened a high school for girls in 1821, where, shockingly, they were actually taught math and science. In 1837, Mary Lyon founded Mount Holyoke Female Seminary, the first women's college, proving that women's brains could in fact handle higher education. More colleges began opening their doors to women, and trailblazers like Elizabeth Blackwell made history by becoming the first woman to earn a medical degree, probably after hearing one too many men say, "But women aren't built for that kind of work." Bit by bit, reformers chipped away at the old systems, proving that when enough determined people decide to change the world, they usually do. Arts and literature. After 1820, American artists finally decided, hey, maybe we should stop copying Europe and paint what's around us. Thus began the rise of a distinctly American style. The Hudson River School, a group of landscape painters, set out to make people feel things by capturing the jaw-dropping beauty of American nature, because nothing stirs the soul like a dramatic sunset over a river. Meanwhile, John James Audubon roamed the countryside painting birds and probably getting pecked at a lot in the process. Writers also got in on the America is awesome trend. Poets like Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, John Greenleaf Whittier, and Francis Watkins Harper wrote about uniquely American topics. Walt Whitman, in particular, went all in on celebrating the spirit of democracy, because nothing says literary greatness like really, really loving America. Meanwhile, Emily Dickinson barely published anything while she was alive, but later became one of America's most famous poets, proving that sometimes playing hard to get works. On the novel front, Herman Melville, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Edgar Allan Poe decided that stories should explore the deep, dark corners of the human mind. Melville gave us Moby Dick, a novel about obsession and one really angry whale, while Poe gave us The Telltale Heart, a story about a guy who probably could have used some therapy. Meanwhile, Louisa May Alcott and other women writers thrived, proving that literature wasn't just a boys' club. Music also took on a uniquely American vibe. Stephen Foster became the era's go-to hitmaker, writing songs that people are still humming today. Dixie, anyone? African Americans created entirely new styles of music, blending African rhythms with European traditions, because when cultures mix, amazing things happen. Then, in New England, a group of deep thinkers called transcendentalists popped up. They believed that the most important truths in life were beyond logic, because who needs reason when you have deep feelings? Ralph Waldo Emerson preached the gospel of individualism, encouraging people to embrace their uniqueness, while his protege, Henry David Thoreau, took things even further. In Walden, he urged folks to ditch city life and live simply in nature, because apparently, nothing is more fulfilling than staring at a pond for 2 years. Thoreau also championed civil disobedience, arguing that if a law is unjust, you shouldn't follow it, an idea that would later inspire leaders like Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. All in all, 19th century America was a creative explosion of painting, poetry, novels, and music. And while some of it was serious and brooding, looking at you, Poe, a lot of it was about celebrating the American spirit and, of course, finding new ways to annoy British literary critics. Okay, let's do our recap. The Industrial Revolution turned America from a sleepy farm town into a factory-fueled powerhouse, complete with deafening machines, overworked laborers, and a whole lot of questionable workplace safety. With the arrival of steam power, factories cranked out goods faster than ever. Railroads turned into the country's first high-speed delivery service, minus the speed limits, and cities grew at a dizzying pace, along with overcrowding, terrible sanitation, and some truly horrifying working conditions. Meanwhile, Samuel Slater jump-started America's textile industry with his photographic memory. Eli Whitney revolutionized manufacturing with interchangeable parts, and Lowell, Massachusetts became the go-to place for hardworking factory girls. Immigration surged as desperate Irish and German workers flooded in, only to be greeted by nativists who thought America should be a members-only club. Down south, cotton ruled the economy, slavery expanded, and plantation owners lived the high life while enslaved workers endured unimaginable hardship. Reformers pushed for change. Abolitionists demanded an end to slavery. Labor unions fought for better conditions. And women's rights activists dared to suggest that maybe, just maybe, women should have a say in things. Meanwhile, American artists and writers finally stopped imitating Europe and started embracing their own unique styles, painting grand landscapes, writing about democracy and emotions, and inventing distinctly American music. The nation was growing, changing, and, let's be honest, getting itself into one massive, inevitable conflict. But for now, it was full steam ahead. There you have it, folks. That is society and culture before the Civil War, nutshelled. Thanks for stopping by Nutshelled History. Don't forget to get industrial on those like and subscribe buttons or else I might get steamed. See y'all next time on Nutshelled History.